Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I'm your host Tony, and today we're going to look at the Crimson Diamond, a text-parser-driven adventure title, developed and published by Julia Minamata for Mac OS and Windows computer platforms in August of 2024. We're going to look at that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. As always, I am excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards, discussions. It is all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewal, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Oliver, and Maximus Marshall. Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., Chris Snowden, The Bay 101, Toucan Sam, Christopher Fose, Grayor, and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. Before we start diving deep into the Crimson Diamond, I thought it would be interesting to talk about why I chose the Crimson Diamond for today's episode of the podcast. The first thing you might note is that the Crimson Diamond is the very first game that we are talking about that is not a true classic game. This was just released in August of 2024, and typically up to this point, we have only covered games that are over 20 years old. So you might be wondering, what the heck is up with that? Well, I'm going to tell you, because I actually want to tell you. This is part of a new format that we're going to be carrying forward for various episodes of Classic Gaming Today. I had mentioned previously that, especially on Discord, I was talking about this on Discord months ago at this point, that as part of our Year 4 content, meaning anything for episodes beyond 150, beyond episode 150, we were going to toy around with some additional formats for certain episodes, one of which is what I'm calling Old is New. So the concept behind this format is it's going to follow, for the most part, the traditional kind of format for episodes that we've had in the past. But what we're going to do is, rather than focus on purely 20-plus year old games, we are going to look at modern games that capture the feeling, or attempt to capture the feeling, of those classic experiences. This might be remasters. It might be something like we're going to look at the remaster of, say, Dark Forces, or any number of titles that Night Dive Studios might be working on, and do a compare and contrast between the new and the old. Or it might mean we're going to look at remakes, so things like the Resident Evil remakes, which, once again, we'll do a comparison, old to new, to see how different companies like Capcom have evolved the state of what they're doing and how they're kind of handling all of those newer games, albeit based on older titles. And occasionally, we're going to look at games that are purely modern experiences, but are designed to recapture and reflect all of the prior classic kinds of mechanics and structures and graphics and all of that good stuff, albeit in a modern package. And that's exactly what we're going to do today as we talk about the Crimson Diamond, because the Crimson Diamond is a modern adventure game that is designed just like an adventure game you might have played in the 1980s. So I thought it'd be interesting for our first episode to look at something that wasn't necessarily a remaster or remake of something that truly existed back then, but was in fact an entirely different experience, albeit one rooted in those same design principles. So that is the basis behind this episode's format. As far as why I chose the Crimson Diamond itself, well, this actually goes back months ago to a discussion that was happening on Discord. This happened right after, I want to say it was right after I had released our episode on Police Quest. And Police Quest is, for those who may not be aware, a text parser based Sierra title from back in the mid 80s. During that episode, I believe I ranked Police Quest as a golden oldie. And before that, I had talked about King's Quest, which is another early Sierra text parser based game. And through both of those, none of them had made them into the Pantheon. We haven't had a text parser game at that point. A text parser game had not made it into the Pantheon. And someone out on Discord said, I wonder if there will ever be a text parser adventure game that makes it into the Pantheon of classic gaming. Because, and this is a true statement, because Tony doesn't really have all that much nostalgia for text parser driven titles. And that is 100% true. My indoctrination into the whole adventure game genre happened with point and click adventures. I didn't really get into computers in general until the later 80s. I didn't have a computer that was capable of running games with any degree of performance or really anything until the very early 90s. And by that point and click gameplay was pretty much becoming the standard across all of the adventure games that were out there. So I did play a ton of Sierra adventure games. I played LucasArts adventure games. I played a ton of different adventure games, all sorts of adventure games. But invariably, all of those games were point and click gameplay. They used a mouse to navigate various scenes. They used traditional point and click kinds of mechanics. There was no text parser in sight. So, and I have, just for awareness, I have gone back and played some of the text parser experiences that predated my introduction into the adventure game genre. But at the point that this discussion was happening on Discord, none of those text parser games had made it into the Pantheon. And the general thought was, well, maybe a text parser game will never make it into the Pantheon because I don't have particular nostalgia for that kind of experience. Now, I would argue and say that the whole point of what we do with this podcast is to try to divorce yourself from the nostalgia and look at it from a more modern perspective. So I don't think that really shortchanged the discussion around Police Quest or King's Quest. But the fact is, I kind of started thinking to myself, well, I've played a bunch of text parser games. Some have been better than others. But for the most part, text parser games have for me, they don't always hit the mark. They are just a little bit too, it's not that they're too old. It's not that they're designed poorly, because that's not the case. But I feel like there was not enough variability or really forethought by many of those games' early designers to really capture the experience of a player trying to figure out their own way through a game. A lot of times those games would focus on what the developers wanted players to do, as opposed to making it more free form and open-ended for players to be able to tackle problems their own way. And actually, out on Discord, somebody said, well, figuring out what to say and what the developers wanted you to put into the parser was almost a puzzle in and of itself. It was part of that overall experience. And okay, I guess that's probably true, but I don't particularly like that. I prefer when the puzzle that you're trying to figure out is not trying to get inside a developer or designer's own brain, but is more so focused on trying to solve the problem in front of you. If I don't know that your object on the ground is a bowl and I think it is a plate, just as a random example, and every time I say pick up plate, it doesn't work, and I have to say pick up bowl for the game to know what the heck I'm talking about, yeah, I could see some logic there, but at the same time, it's not always user-friendly to the player. And there are some times where, because of the graphics that were prevalent around that time, around the mid to late 80s, even early 80s, or certainly earlier 80s, there are some graphics issues there as well, where developers didn't have all of the graphical capabilities to be able to deliver a game that had visual fidelity to enough degree that it would actually let you know what that object is. You might look at something on the ground and it could look like a pixely mess. It's like, what the heck is that? And you've got to figure out what it is, hopefully based on context clues, but sometimes it can be really challenging to understand what something was, and then, once again, you're kind of stuck with these text parser games. Point-and-click gameplay did away with all that, and I know that there are individuals that say point-and-click gameplay actually makes the overall experience too streamlined and removes a lot of the challenge that was associated with text parser games. Yes, I can see that argument, but I would also argue that text parser games can be a bit unapproachable and requires a very specific mindset in order to actually tackle. Otherwise, you run the risk of getting frustrated, irritated, and potentially just turned off of the entire experience. So anyway, with that context in mind, I started thinking to myself, well, what would a really good text parser game look like? Certainly there have been good ones in the past, but I was curious what kinds of experiences existed in the modern day because, as with anything, even though there are certain styles of game that have fallen out of fashion or fallen out of favor over the years, there are still little niches out there in the gaming community where a lot of these older styles or styles that might not be as popular today, they still have an audience and they still have a certain degree of focus. So I started looking out there and trying to see what might be out there from a modern perspective. And as and this was the end of 2024, I was looking through various video game news sites and game awards shows and write-ups for best games of the year, and I came upon this game called The Crimson Diamond. And I looked at it and I thought, whoa, this actually looks really interesting. It's a text parser based EGA-graphics, Roland MT32 sound adventure game developed and published in 2024. And I thought to myself, this is perfect. This is the perfect way to test. I wanted to test myself and see whether I could look at a modern game designed with a text parser. And by the way, The Crimson Diamond was widely considered to be a really good game amongst a lot of the community, a lot of the adventure game community. So I thought, okay, if everybody is saying this one's good, let me give it a go. And I will be able to see once and for all whether I have some sort of issue with text parser games, or if perhaps the text parser games I had played up to that point were simply just a little bit more obtuse than what they should have been or what they could have been if looked at from a more modern perspective. So that is why I chose to look at The Crimson Diamond for today's episode of the podcast. I wanted to know, did I really have an issue with text parser games? Or was it just that most of the older games I had played were a bit more cumbersome than what I personally enjoy? It's time to start talking about some history, and in particular, the history behind the creation of the Crimson Diamond. Now, unlike many of the various games that we look at for this podcast, the Crimson Diamond itself is not all that old. It was released in 2024. That means that all of the historical stuff that we typically look at for these games, the history is kind of light. The history is very short because it's a modern title. But that doesn't mean that there isn't something to talk about here, because, as we'll learn, the Crimson Diamond, even though it's a modern game, has all of its foundational elements based on games that came out well before the Crimson Diamond. In fact, you can trace the Crimson Diamond's lineage over 4 decades earlier than its actual release. Or at least I'll say 3.5 decades. Probably around there. But anyway, it has its foundations in the early days of the adventure game genre. And as longtime listeners know, I have a great fondness for adventure games in general. I love adventure games. I love the fact that you get to explore these worlds, that you get to try to solve puzzles, interact with various people across the navigatable spaces that you might be inhabiting or might be exploring in the game. I love everything about adventure games. which is why years ago I actually hosted a podcast devoted exclusively to the adventure game genre called Point and Click, an adventure game podcast. But back when I was doing that show, I never really went too far deep into what I would call true adventure game history. I did touch upon some of the early classics by Sierra, but at the time, I was more focused on experiencing things from a more modern perspective. So as an example, when I covered Leisure Suit Larry in that podcast, I didn't look at the original Leisure Suit Larry. I looked at Leisure Suit Larry Reloaded, which was the modernized version of the original Leisure Suit Larry game. Similar kinds of things with King's Quest. I didn't play the very original King's Quest. I played the fan remake that came out a little bit later, which most notably allowed for the reduction or removal of some of the, I'll say, more unfair deaths that could sometimes permeate Sierra adventure titles, especially around that era of gaming. So when I looked at all these games for that particular podcast, I didn't really expose myself too much to text parser titles, even though some of the games I looked at were based on text parser games. The fact is that the adventure game genre has a long and rich history that started from the very text-focused Adventure or Colossal Cave Adventure that Will Crowther worked on back in the late 70s. That is effectively the grandfather of the entire adventure game genre. And as you might expect, it is based entirely on text. It is effectively a form of interactive fiction where everything in the game is presented to you via text, via actual words on the screen. You interact with the game by entering text into a parser and assuming that you can write something that the computer understands, something will happen in the game world. And that formed the foundation for many of the earliest adventure games within the genre. It would actually form the foundation of pretty much every adventure game until Roberta Williams came up with the concept of including graphics alongside a text parser interface, which she did back in the early 80s with the introduction of the game called Mystery House. Mystery House was revolutionary, not because it got rid of the text parser interface, because there was certainly a text parser in that game, but it married traditional text parser gameplay with visual graphics on the screen, which was the first time that had ever happened in an adventure game. Of course, over time, that general concept and that general framework would continue to evolve. And Sierra Online, and actually online systems at the time, but then eventually Sierra Online, as it would come to be known, would be responsible for a number of these early adventure game experiences, trying to embed graphics and more and higher quality graphics over time into these traditionally text-based games. The whole concept of text parser gameplay was pretty much prevalent throughout most of the 1980s. It was simply because there wasn't really a thought of how to use a different user interface in order to interact with games. It was the standard for a reason. It worked, and people who played adventure games around that time expected text parser interfaces whenever they fired up a title. That being said, as the 80s progressed, there were different pockets of the community that started to experiment with point-and-click gameplay, using a mouse to drive all of your interactions with the game world, as opposed to the more traditional keyboard text inputs. The point-and-click gameplay that such games as Deja Vu and other early adventure games pioneered really became the standard moving forward, especially into the later 80s and throughout the 90s, as the text parser interface fell out of favor, replaced with the point-and-click gameplay that make up what I would consider to be the golden age of adventure games. That being said, while point-and-click gameplay definitely made adventure games more accessible to the general gaming population and certainly served to popularize the adventure game genre into the early 90s, that doesn't mean that everybody was fully bought on or fully on board with the whole concept of point-and-click gameplay as opposed to text parser interfaces. There were a number of people who actually preferred text parser interfaces from around the 80s because they thought that it provided a degree of freedom that point-and-click gameplay simply couldn't provide. And to understand why that is, just think about it from this perspective. With a point-and-click game, let's look at a game like The Secret of Monkey Island, just as an example. One of the earlier point-and-click games that really achieved a degree of popularity and is widely considered to be one of the better adventure games of all time. With The Secret of Monkey Island, you're presented with a series of verb commands on the screen that basically limits what you can do within that game world. If you have a verb command to do something, you can do it. If you don't, then you can't. So, for somebody who is playing a point-and-click adventure game, having a list of verbs or, a little bit later, a set of icons that represent the actions you can take in a game can be a little bit constricting because it means you can only play within this particular sandbox of potential commands. Now, on the same token, or by the same token, that also makes gameplay a little bit more streamlined because you don't have to guess at the different commands that are available within the game. You know what they are. You know that these 10 verbs, as an example, those are the commands you can execute within the game world. So it makes things a little bit more streamlined. You don't have to guess, oh, well, do I have to type pick up or use or get or take? It's just, well, you click on the verb or the icon that represents the command you want to do, and you do it. You don't have to worry about trying to figure out or get inside the developer's head to figure out what specific verb or command you need to enter into a text parser in order to make something happen. So from that perspective, point-and-click gameplay definitely made adventure games more streamlined. But the other side of that coin, and the argument that many text parser aficionados often talk about, is the fact that while yes, that makes adventure games more streamlined, it also removes a degree of freedom that you once had with text parser titles, because technically you could type anything you want into a text parser game, and the computer may do something. Note that I say may do something, because many of the earlier text parser games, while they did allow for a degree of freedom and allow you to kind of write your own story, so to speak, and that you can put in the words that you think make the most sense, most often, and I mean, I don't have a ton of text parser experience. I have a fair amount, but I certainly haven't played every text parser game. But most often, at least in my experience, text parsers, while allowing you the freedom to put in whatever you want, were oftentimes a little bit more restrictive, at least in terms of what you end up doing in order to solve some of these games, because it was really difficult to figure out what some developers were thinking when they actually designed their text parser interfaces. A lot of times, it may not have been quite as straightforward as what some of the text parser proponents would make you believe. And I'm not poo-pooing anything about text parsers. I enjoy all sorts of adventure games, all sorts of styles of adventure game. But the simple fact is that text parser interfaces, if designed well, can be incredibly freeing and give you a degree of player choice and freedom that is almost unparalleled. But when not designed all that well, it can be really, really frustrating. I mention all of this to say that regardless of when you personally entered the adventure game pantheon, or whatever the right word is, regardless of when you first started playing adventure games, the fact is that many people have a particular fondness for one style or another. And a lot of times, even game developers today have taken influences from the games that they played in their youth. And many of these developers nowadays are attempting to recapture the feeling of playing these games from their youth. And that is exactly what Julia Minamata attempted to do when she sat down to create the Crimson Diamond. Like many people, Julia had played a ton of adventure games as a kid, both Sierra titles like The Colonel's Bequest and Quest for Glory, as well as LucasArts titles like the aforementioned Monkey Island series. At the same time, she was also enthralled by mystery novels like those by Agatha Christie, which, by the way, I know a ton about because I am an Agatha Christie fan is too loose of a word. I love Agatha Christie stories. I am deep into the Agatha Christie realm and domain. I think that her mysteries are phenomenal. So anytime I hear anything that mentions Agatha Christie-like content, my ears immediately perk up. And Julia Minamata had a similar kind of feeling. She loved books by Agatha Christie with all of those different twists and turns and mysteries that she never really found out the true answer to until the final pages of the novel. She loved that kind of stuff. She also loved book series like The Hardy Boys, which I also have experience with from my youth, which is effectively a couple of brothers that go on these detective adventure kind of stuff. So she was always engaged with both adventure games and detective stories, which honestly is not a surprising intersection because a lot of times adventure games do have a mystery at the heart of them that needs to be solved in some way. So the fact that adventure gamers kind of like mystery stories, that's not particularly shocking. But what is a little bit more beyond the scope of what most adventure gamers and book readers do is Minamata looked at this and she said, I want to create an adventure game. I want to create my own adventures inspired by the games that I played as a child and also inspired by the mysteries that I enjoyed in my youth. That being said, Minamata is not a technical person, or has not been a technical person. She didn't go to school for software development. She didn't get a degree in computer science. She didn't really use any sort of development tools before she decided to start working on the Crimson Diamond. She had a dream of creating an adventure game, or at least her own adventures, but she didn't really think something like that would be feasible as someone without any sort of real software development skills. So instead, Minamata decided to focus more so on her creative talents. She became a freelance illustrator for various publications, and she had been happy exploring the creative side of her personality. She loved creating artwork for different magazines or just in general in her spare time. She didn't really think there was going to be anything beyond that, but she really enjoyed what she was doing. That is until one day she discovered the tool package known as Adventure Game Studio. Now, for anybody who hasn't heard about Adventure Game Studio, this is a software package that has existed literally for decades at this point, and it is designed in order to allow amateur designers to be able to create their own adventure games. And yes, it does have some technical kinds of considerations that you might need to worry about, but at the same time, Adventure Game Studio is designed so that it doesn't need a huge degree of software development know-how in order to create something that is truly meaningful and engaging. It's designed to be almost like a layperson's adventure game creation toolkit, much simpler to use than other tools that are a little bit more focused on software development like Unity or Unreal Engine or any number of other engines that are out there. Adventure Game Studio has one singular purpose, which is to allow people to create adventure games in the style of their choosing. Though the program does come with several, I'll say, predefined. I haven't used it in a while. I did try to use Adventure Game Studio years and years ago, so I don't know all about the modern versions, but I know that it used to have some what I'll call loose templates around certain game types. Like it certainly supports the Scum-based kind of view of the world. It certainly supports a lot of the Sierra-focused adventure games. So it has some of that stuff built in already. So when Minamata discovered Adventure Game Studio, she thought to herself, well, this is an opportunity to use a different kind of tool to create something potentially cool using computer technology, even though she didn't have any formal development or technical training. But she also knew that sitting down and declaring that she was going to create an adventure game from scratch after never having done anything like that before might be a little bit too much of a leap. So when she started using Adventure Game Studio, all she started to do was create various scenes using pixel art, leveraging her creative talents and trying to create scenes that evoked the same kind of feeling as the games that she had enjoyed from her youth. So she started designing backgrounds. She started designing new rooms, furniture. She even created a character to move around in a given scene, simply to give a sense of scale and to kind of see what that would look like within this overall concept or within this overall structure that Adventure Game Studio was able to create. As she started to look at this, she originally simply wanted to create artwork with a similar style to her favorite adventure games from her youth, which were prominently EGA text-parser styled experiences. But she wasn't really at the point where she was ready to create a full-fledged game. So she kept sitting down, she kept designing scenes and objects, she began to animate some of the placeholder character artwork that she created, she began to move that character around the different scenes, and slowly but surely she realized that even though she didn't sit down to begin creating an adventure game, that's exactly what she was kind of doing at this point. She was creating all of the core elements that would eventually turn into an adventure game. She wasn't just creating art. Now, she hadn't really done any coding. She didn't have any story for the game. And in fact, even though at this point she realized she was basically starting to create an adventure game, she did not want to focus on the story at all. She wanted to continue designing the game world. So she literally created the entire game world without any regard to the story or narrative. Minamata figured she could add that later. So instead of focusing on what I would call a traditional game design, She simply used her creative talents to create a game world. And as she did that, she would come up with a world filled with different objects, scenes, and areas to explore. And once she finished doing all of that, she decided it was time to work on the game's story, its characters, and ultimately the puzzles to solve. Now, she loved EGA-based adventure games, and in particular, she loved playing text parser games back when she was a child. So she knew that anything she was going to do here was going to focus on that overall design. She already had the design aesthetic around EGA-graphics. That was something she built into the game world as she was building all of the different scenes and objects that she's been working on. But as far as the story, she would take inspiration from those mystery novels that she had played previously, and as far as puzzles, she would take inspiration from many of the Sierra-based titles that she had loved. But while she loved those old school adventure games, and in particular loved old school Sierra games, she recognized that the puzzles and the situations in some of those titles could be a bit harsh. So, when Minamata decided to design the overall narrative and puzzles for the Crimson Diamond, she was resolved and made sure that all of the puzzles she created for the game did not fall into the common trap that many old school Sierra games fell into, which was, to put it lightly, some interesting game design decisions, and some which were just downright baffling, leading to the whole concept of moon logic, where the only way to solve a puzzle is literally to crawl inside the brains of the game designer and try everything to try to figure out how to do something. Logic didn't always rule the day back with these old school titles. But with the Crimson Diamond, Minamata was determined to make sure that she would create a game that not only was a love letter to the EGA text parser games of her youth, but would also represent a modern version of those games, something that gamers, even today, could play and hopefully enjoy. Eventually, after several years of solo, and that is truly solo development work, Minamata worked on every aspect of the game by herself, other than the music, which was composed by a musician named Dan Policar, who used, and I love this by the way, a real Roland MT32 to record all of the tracks in the game. We're going to talk all about the Roland MT32 a little bit later. But after all of that development, after all of that solo-focused effort, the Crimson Diamond would finally be ready for release, and it would come out on computer platforms, predominantly the Mac OS and Windows platforms, on August 15th of 2024. When the Crimson Diamond came out, it would receive very positive critical praise, with most publications praising the game's throwback graphics and elegant, and I did say elegant, text parser interface that was so much better to interact with than real old school text parsers. Almost everyone who played the game declared it to be a lovingly crafted homage to old school adventures, though I will say that some individuals did complain about the difficulty of the puzzles. I will let you know my own opinion of those puzzles in just a little bit, but suffice it to say, and this is not really a spoiler for our future discussion, but anybody who thinks the puzzles in the Crimson Diamond were too challenging or more challenging than they should have been probably needs to spend some time with those old text parser games, because this is nothing like that. I actually think the puzzles in Crimson Diamond are phenomenal, but we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Overall, though, the Crimson Diamond has been widely complimented and praised as making the old feel new again, and is a testament to Julia Minamata's talent. And I know I, for one, am curious as to what she may decide to do next, because the Crimson Diamond, that was a really strong first showing by somebody who, up to this point, had never even considered making a video game. Putting that aside, I was curious. As I sat down to begin playing the game, I was really wondering whether the Crimson Diamond could truly evoke the feelings of the past, while still providing an experience that modern gamers can enjoy. And that is exactly the question that I am going to attempt to answer right now. It's now time to start talking about what it feels like to play the Crimson Diamond. The first thing that everybody needs to recognize, and we've talked about this already a little bit, but the Crimson Diamond, despite being a modern title, is not a modern title. This is an old school text parser based adventure game, complete with all of the pros and cons that typically come along with that kind of experience. Though this one does have some modern amenities thrown in to make the overall experience feel a little bit more accessible than what many of the older school text parser games may have felt. You can use your mouse for very basic navigation around the game world, meaning literally just moving around the game world. So you do have a degree of what I would call pseudo point-and-click gameplay, and when you're navigating or looking in your inventory, you can use your mouse to examine items in your inventory, which is a nice touch. But otherwise, you're going to have to use the text parser input, and you're going to have to use your keyboard to pretty much do anything you want to do with the game itself. There are no icons to select from using your mouse. There are no verb wheels. There's not even verb commands on the screen. Everything is text parser driven. I will say also that even though you can use your mouse for navigation around the game world, I honestly didn't prefer to do that. I preferred to use the arrow keys on my keyboard, which created, at least from my perspective, a true old school adventure game experience. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about the general game structure and how the game overall is designed. The Crimson Diamond features 7 different chapters to play through. 6 of them feature very traditional adventure gameplay, meaning going around different scenes, talking to different characters, picking up and using different items and objects, solving puzzles, and basically figuring out what the heck you're supposed to do as you move through the game's story. The 7th chapter is a little bit different, and we're going to talk about that in a fair amount of detail later on. But just to give a little bit of a preview, the 7th chapter is effectively the culmination of the entire experience and represents the conclusion to your specific adventure, meaning all of the choices that you've made, all of the clues and different things that you've observed, and all of the things you may have missed will lead to the 7th chapter, where you'll have to effectively go through an interrogation of sorts and provide any of the evidence, clues, and other observations that you've personally experienced throughout your playthrough. That will then lead to one of 4 different endings, but even though there are only 4 different endings in the game, which by itself is commendable, there are a ton of different permutations that can lead to one of those 4 endings, making it so that the way you play the game is truly up to you, and your overall understanding, enjoyment, and just what you get out of the experience is highly dependent on how good of a detective you personally are. Now, moving away from the 7th chapter, which like I said, we will talk about in greater detail. All of the main chapters in the game, those being the first 6 chapters, are typically fairly traditional in that when you enter a chapter, it's usually with some sort of goal in mind, like, say, taking mineral samples from the environment or investigating a specific crime. And for the most part, the rest of an individual chapter is focused on that specific main objective. Fairly traditional adventure game style gameplay. The thing is, how you address that objective is largely up to you. You know how in many adventure games, you are along for the ride, so to speak, where you will always, and it doesn't matter who you are or when you're playing the game or how you're playing the game, you have to progress through the same exact story as other people. Think about a game that is as revered as The Secret of Monkey Island. This is like the 2nd or 3rd time that I've referred to The Secret of Monkey Island. Even though it's not a text parser interface game, it's a game that many adventure gamers have played in the past, and even some non-adventure gamers have played in the past. So I use that as just a general kind of guidepost, so to speak, as we have this discussion. Think about a game like The Secret of Monkey Island. Moving through that game, there is very little chance that you're going to have an experience that is dramatically different than, say, your friend playing The Secret of Monkey Island, or me playing The Secret of Monkey Island, or anyone else playing The Secret of Monkey Island. The Secret of Monkey Island is The Secret of Monkey Island, which in this case is a good thing because The Secret of Monkey Island is a really good game. But in general, it's the same. It's the same regardless of who plays it. The Crimson Diamond is not. And this is where the most unique aspect of the game, from my perspective, comes into play. Now, within each chapter, there are several checkpoints that you have to progress through, and those checkpoints signify your overall progression towards your goal. But the fact is that the specific way you play the game will ultimately dictate what you see, learn, and notice as you play the game. That will lead into how you solve puzzles, which, by the way, are pretty much universally amazing in the game, made sense within the game world, and didn't have any degree of needing to use a walkthrough if you're fairly observant. They do have some challenge. There are some challenging puzzles here, but they've struck a nice balance between too challenging and not enough challenge. It was pretty much right at the sweet spot, at least from my perspective. Anyway, all of the observations that you make as you play the game will contribute to your ability to solve those amazing puzzles, as well as affect how you interact with different characters throughout the game world. And those characters all have their own agendas, and there might be different events that happen within the game that you may or may not be able to see or observe, simply because when you make a choice to go do something over in a different location, you might miss something happening at another location. Now, I should say that for anybody who has some experience with more of the time-based adventure games like The Last Express, this is not like that. It's not like this game is playing out across a series of timelines or real time or anything like that. But there are certain events that trigger other events. And if you happen to miss one of the prior events because you triggered the next set of events, you may in fact miss out on learning more about the game and its game world. This is not an issue because ultimately it's your choice that dictates what happens when. And if you miss something, that's just reason to play it again if you don't pick up on some of the other more nuanced clues or things that are happening within the game world. Anyway, moving forward, I loved the way that this was overall designed. And I loved the fact that there were different events that happened within the game that you could potentially miss. And some of those events would have hints sprinkled in that would help you solve other puzzles or learn what to do next. As long as you're observant, even if you miss some of these events, you will likely be able to get through this game without a problem, and probably without a walkthrough. Though there were a couple of situations where I sat there for a few minutes scratching my head as far as what to do next. At the end of the day, though, everything is exceedingly logical, not in a bad way, but in the best way, and it is awesome to experience in this game. Like I was just mentioning, the game is linear in that there is a specific story and checkpoints to progress through, but there really is a huge amount of potential variability that occurs during a playthrough based on your level of investigative prowess. I mentioned that you could miss certain encounters. There are even some items that you might miss, which, let me tell you, is going to have an impact on how the game plays out. There's also missable conversations and even clues that make it so that by the time you get to the ending, you may legitimately not know how to answer certain questions because you simply missed the story thread or you missed the clue thread that would have allowed you to solve that particular answer or answer that particular question. It's a really interesting design and one that I thought both encouraged replayability as well as made it so that by the time you reached the conclusion of the story, it really felt like you yourself had experienced that story. We're going to talk a little bit about gameplay now, because obviously the elephant in the room as it relates to the Crimson Diamond is the fact that it is a text parser game. And I've already talked a bunch about the pros, the cons, and some of the ugly stuff that came along with text parser games from the early days of the adventure game genre. The thing is that most text parser games, and I'm going to say this in a very general way, so I'm not meaning to stereotype or make it so that I don't want you to think that every single text parser adventure game has an issue, because they don't. But the vast majority of text parser adventure games are, generally speaking, a little bit cumbersome. we talked about the fact that you need to guess what the computer or the game's designers want you to do in certain situations. You need to guess what the game calls certain objects. There are some games, and especially as the text parser games evolved over the course of the 80s, there were some games that did a great job of creating synonyms for various commands or various objects so that it really did feel like whatever you put into the parser, it would absolutely work. And those text parser games, from my perspective, are the highlights of the genre from that point in gaming. The question is, how does the Crimson Diamond handle this kind of situation? Well, the good news is that for the most part, the parser here works much better than nearly any old school parser title from 40-ish years ago. There's a number of different features in the text parser for the Crimson Diamond that make the overall experience feel dramatically less cumbersome and more streamlined than what you would possibly expect for a text parser-based game. As an example, there are a number of shortcuts that are built into the overall interface. You have shortcuts for character names where, and I'm just going to use hypothetical examples. Let's say you're trying to talk to a person named Tony T, just as an example. Well, instead of typing into the text parser, ask Tony T about something, you could simply put ask TT about something. A little bit of a shortcut, but one that over time will allow you to save a lot of time as you type various commands into the game. There's also certain common verbs, the ones that you would use throughout the game in a more traditional kind of format, like examine, look, search, that kind of stuff, pick up, those kind of things. A lot of those verbs have shortcuts as well, so that you don't have to type out the full verb in the text parser. You can type in an abbreviation, and that abbreviation the game understands, and then you'd be able to do something within the game world. Now, at the same time, when you have these common verbs, there is a great degree of, or there's a large number of synonyms included within the game, such that you can type pick up, take, get, and probably any other number of synonyms that for picking up something that actually work within the game. And I tried a bunch of different words in different contexts just to try to see if I could break the parser. Now, yes, I could. If you get esoteric enough and you get if you get cheeky enough, you can certainly break the parser in the Crimson Diamond. It is not all-knowing, but it is very much better designed and has a lot more flexibility than what a lot of the older school text parsers were able to do. Part of that is just the technology available today, but part of that is also Julia Minamata's focus on delivering an experience that is more accessible than many of those older school text parser-based games. In addition to those shortcuts, which I really appreciated, and by the end of the time you play the game, you're going to have all of these abbreviations memorized. So when you type something out, it's almost going to look like pseudocode because you're not typing out full words almost anywhere. You're typing a bunch of abbreviations, and it's like if somebody looked at it without any context, they would think, what the heck is that? But for you, who have just played the game and experienced the entire game, it makes perfect sense. So anyway, beyond those abbreviations, the synonyms, and the overall streamlining of the parser inputs, there's also some additional streamlining built into the game. As an example, you can actually issue the equivalent of batch commands in the text parser. So let's say you're in a room and you walk up to a bureau that has a set of drawers in it. Well, you could, if you wanted to, type open drawer or open left drawer, open right drawer, open center drawer, and then look in left drawer, look in right drawer, look in center drawer. Or you could potentially type search left drawer, which combines opening the drawer and looking in it. Or you could even type search drawers, which will open up in sequence each of the individual drawers within that bureau and look inside them. So you can walk up and basically, so think about it like this. If you walked up to a bureau or a nightstand or a cabinet or something that had 3 drawers in it, you could either execute 6 individual text parser commands, or you may even be able to execute 1 text parser command, the search command, and use the plural of the form drawers or of the word drawers, which will then literally search every single drawer. And as you go through and as the game goes through and searches individual drawers, it'll pop up a text box on the screen that tells you what it finds, what it doesn't find, and then you can take some sort of action beyond that. These batch commands, which I'm going to be honest, I don't recall many of these batch commands from early text parser games, but it's entirely possible that I'm simply not recalling them and they do in fact exist. So take this with a grain of salt. But I will say that within the Crimson Diamond, the batch commands really save some time. And once you figure out all of the different ways you can kind of streamline your overall inputs to make the game do what you want it to do, it feels amazing to experience. Additionally, talking to various characters, which can sometimes be a bit hit or miss in text parser games, is surprisingly deep here. There's a pretty large number of words and different keywords that someone might know about that you can talk to them about. I thought this was a great addition to the game and made it so that a lot of the conversations had a sort of free-flowing kind of feel to them that you sometimes don't get with the traditional dialogue tree types of interfaces, or interfaces where you have all of the different topics that you can potentially ask about, which, if you're like me, you will ask about. You will ask about every single topic in a given dialogue tree, almost exhaustively, to make sure that you don't miss anything that the game has to tell you. Without that kind of interface, you kind of feel a little bit, I'll say, it's not that you feel completely without direction, but it does make you actually think harder about what you might want to learn from individual characters. This is an aspect of the game that I absolutely agree, or actually, this is an aspect of text parser gameplay that I absolutely agree is more free and also provides for greater degrees of personal interaction with a game than what traditional point-and-click games do. Because here, you don't have a list of topics that the game has told you is important. You've got to figure out what the specific topics are that are important, and you might need to jot them down in your own personal notebook and then cycle through each of those topics for individual characters. Basically, you take that interface element away where the game is telling you what's important and you have to figure out what's important. That's a cool logical leap, and it's something that makes you feel a lot more like a real detective exploring an environment. So I really enjoyed that aspect of the game. Though I will say that the discussion system or the dialogue system with the different characters, this is an area where I think there could have been some improvement. There are some very obvious conversation threads that feel like they were left unaddressed. Some conversation starters appeared to be going somewhere and then go nowhere. It's not really a huge deal, but it is definitely something that reminded me of the older school design where things might have not been fleshed out quite as much. It's not, once again, not a big deal at the end of the day, but something that I feel could have been improved upon. Now, here's the thing, though. Even if you decide that this sounds amazing, even if you say, oh, yes, I want to play the Crimson Diamond, I do have to say, and I do have to caution you, that getting used to using a text parser for a modern game, even if that modern game has a lot of different features built in that streamline the overall experience, getting used to using a text parser as opposed to any other degree of input will take some getting used to. You do need to shift your mindset just a little bit in order to get really focused on how you're going to play this game. Eventually, and luckily, the parser usage, especially in the Crimson Diamond, will become second nature. And with the various shortcuts and abbreviations that are built into the parser, you'll actually end up with a pretty breezy experience. Even though you'd assume that having to type everything into the parser in order to do things would be more cumbersome. The fact is, it is not. And this actually feels like a really refreshing change of pace for an adventure game experience in modern times. Other than the parser interface, most of the rest of the gameplay for the game should be fairly familiar to anyone who's ever played an adventure game, whether you're talking about the point-and-click kind of experiences of the 90s, the text parser experiences of the 80s, or something in between. Generally, though, I do want to say that all of the traditional adventure game staples that you might have been familiar with over time certainly apply here. You want to look at and examine, and those are two separate commands just for your awareness. You want to look at and examine everything you can. You never know when a clue might be hidden somewhere just beyond your sight. So you want to make sure that you are looking at and examining everything you can, both inventory items as well as items and characters within the environment. There are some clues that only impact your understanding of the game's story, events, and potential endings. But there are also some clues that are just there to have fun with. And honestly, you should try to do your best to be a good detective. Even if there might be red herrings, and even if there might be certain clues that don't feel like they really add to the game itself, it's just fun to inhabit this game world and be a detective. I really enjoyed, and this is something that I thought Minamata did a great job with. You know how in Jane Jensen games like the Gabriel Knight series, she embeds real-world history with the overall storyline and narrative that she wants to get across within the game. And ultimately, you could technically go out and research that real-world history and see where the game and historical context intersect. Well, the Crimson Diamond isn't quite that deep, but because of the story behind the game, which involves geology and mineralogy and all that kind of stuff, there's a surprising amount of factoids included in the game around geologic formations and mineralogy, which I will freely admit I don't know a ton about, but it was kind of cool to learn more about that playing the game. It reminded me of a Jane Jensen-esque experience where real-world stuff got included in the game, and I really enjoyed that aspect of the overall experience. There's another cool feature in the game, and this is kind of like a sidebar. It's almost goes back to what we were talking about with the dialogue system. While most of the time when you're interacting with characters, you'll have a direct dialogue with them, there are occasions within the game where you can actually eavesdrop on other characters, whether kind of sauntering up to a door or sneaking up to a door and leaning to the side and listening in, or potentially if a door is closed, there might be an object in the game world that if you pick it up and hold it near the door, you might be able to amplify some of those voices. And anybody who has seen an old detective movie at pretty much any point will probably be able to guess what that object and interaction is. But regardless, I've got to say, I loved this eavesdropping aspect of the game, especially because if you're not stealthy enough, you can miss these conversations. Somebody might notice you, in which case the game is going to play out just a little bit differently. And if you miss clues, that means it could impact your ability to understand what's happening in the game story. The game story may in fact shift. Once again, just a little bit. It's not like it's going to be dramatically different. Well, actually, I take that back. The different endings that can play out are fairly dramatically different from one another, but I don't think that the individual narrative, I'll say, checkpoints within the game have that much of a difference. It's more about how much you observe and how much you can apply those observations to the overall experience. That's really where the focus is here. But anyway, I loved that aspect of the game. And honestly, I loved a lot of different aspects of the game. And I can't impress upon you, if I look at this thing in whole, if I look at the Crimson Diamond in totality, I cannot impress upon you enough how cool it feels to play a game that does not hold your hand, but still doesn't block progress. Even though you can miss things, even though you can miss different dialogues or items or clues or whatever, there are no dead-end states here. You can conceivably make your way through the game like a totally ignorant buffoon, and the game still keeps going. You're not necessarily going to get the most fulfilling ending if you do that, or if you completely neglect all of your detective responsibilities, but at the end of the day, the game will not prevent you from doing that, and I thought that was really, really cool. Normally at this point, we take a look at the back of the box for the game, but as I think most people are aware, when you have PC games around like today, there is no back of the box to speak of. There's nothing there because it just doesn't exist anymore, which is certainly something that I personally miss. That being said, the replacement for the back of the box is effectively Steam. So I am going to read the short description that appears on the Steam store page. So for the Crimson Diamond, which is not in a box, unfortunately, the Steam page says, The Crimson Diamond is an EGA text-parser mystery adventure game where you play as amateur geologist and reluctant detective Nancy Maple. Nancy is born and raised in Toronto, Canada, where she works as a clerk for the Royal Canadian Museum. She dreams of attending university to study geology and mineralogy, and she's prepared to venture into the unknown to achieve her goals. Follow Nancy as she travels north to the ghost town of Crimson, Ontario to investigate the discovery of a massive diamond in the area. Eavesdrop on conversations to learn more about the eccentric cast of characters who find themselves gathered at Crimson Lodge. Explore the lodge and its environs to evaluate the diamond claim, and maybe solve a mystery or two along the way. The Crimson Diamond is a cozy mystery that encourages reading and engaging in the story over devious arcade challenges. And then there is a quote here by somebody that most people probably recognize. If you love the old murder mystery games like the Laraboe Mystery Series, you will enjoy this game by Julia Minamata, The Crimson Diamond. The art style will give you that sentimental feel of the first Laraboe mystery, The Colonel's Bequest. If you relish the nostalgia of the old games, perhaps taking you back to your childhood, this game will do it for you. It has the requisite feel of an Agatha Christie novel set in the early 20th century. It even has a parser interface so that you can question the other characters that you meet, develop your own hunches, and write your notes along the way. It's an observational detective type of game, and for those who love mysteries and suspense, you should really give this game a chance. To coin an old phrase, it's the bee's knees. That quote comes from Roberta Williams, the grandmother of the adventure game genre. So that is what the Steam page says for the Crimson Diamond, and I have got to say 150 million% yes, this sells me on the game. It sold me on the game when I took a look at it to see if I actually wanted to play this game, as I was looking for something to play in a text parser kind of format, and just reading it again now and looking at the screenshots, because there are obviously some screenshots and gameplay videos included on the Steam page. Yes, this game, or this page, sells me on the title. Of course, I did buy the title in order to play through it and talk about it today, but 100%, if you are a fan of old school adventure games, it's just, well, yeah. I can't imagine you looking at this page and saying to yourself, I'm going to skip on that one. Nope, I don't think it's possible. So it definitely sells me on the game. We're going to move on beyond the Steam page and start talking about the more specific aspects of the game, and we're going to start by talking about the graphics. The fact is that the graphics in the Crimson Diamond are pure EGA-styled graphics, with most of the limitations that you might expect. But regardless of those limitations, the game looks great. It never felt like it was subpar from a visual perspective. It just feels like stylistically there's a limited color palette at play. That being said, the color palettes and the colors here, they feel way more detailed than a true EGA adventure experience. I might be off, and I might be just not really understanding how the different colors blended together on the screen to make things look as good as they do. But as I'm looking at the screenshots, I'm just looking at the screenshots right now as we're talking from Steam on the Crimson Diamond. And yes, I guess it's possible that these really are just pure EGA graphics, but if so, there is a degree of artistic styling here that is light years beyond nearly any EGA game that I've personally played. The graphics here look phenomenal, and if this was really only accomplished using EGA limitations, meaning real EGA limitations, then I've got to tip my hat to Julia Minamata, because the game looks phenomenal. Animations as well are all pretty much perfect for the style of game that this is meant to represent. It is simply a really good looking game, and I was truly impressed with the overall visuals on display. Moving on to the sound and music, the music here is 100% perfect. And like I mentioned earlier, it was composed and recorded using a real Roland MT32. For anyone who may not be aware, back in the early days of DOS gaming, there were some limited sound capabilities built into most computers. You had, for a long time, the PC speaker, which was only really capable of playing bleeps and bloops and other very solid, I'll say, sounding tones. It was basically had the ability to play some simple tones and simple notes on those tones or with those tones, almost similar to like a like a very simple synthesizer kind of thing, but you didn't have chords. Just as an example, you couldn't play chords, you couldn't play multiple notes at the same time. You couldn't do any of that. The PC speaker was very limited. Now, of course, there were some companies that pushed the envelope with the PC speaker technology, like Access Software with their Real Sound technology, which enabled PC speakers to actually play back pre-recorded digital audio. But outside of those specific examples, for the most part, the PC speaker didn't really have a level of audio fidelity to support complex music in games. That would start to change with the advent of sound cards, dedicated hardware that you could install in your computer that would then be able to synthesize sounds in different ways. A lot of those early sound cards were fairly simple in comparison to ones that would follow, but they did allow for a degree of audio fidelity well beyond the traditional PC speaker. And then there was the Roland MT32, which is by far the sound card for early DOS gaming. Once the Roland MT32 came out on the market, which, by the way, cost hundreds of dollars and was highly publicized by Sierra Online because a number of their games would start utilizing Roland MT32 soundtracks, at least as an option for anybody who had that hardware. But when the MT32 came out, it became the standard for DOS soundtracks. Now, the thing is, because it was so expensive, not a ton of people had MT32s because the MT32 was really not being marketed solely as a computer sound card. It was actually a synthesis device that musicians could use if they wanted to. But the MT32 did become a mainstay in many DOS gaming rigs of the time, especially for individuals who cared about a level of audio fidelity and the quality of soundtracks. The MT32 was the standard, and it was the standard before General MIDI really took over in the early 90s. That being said, the Crimson Diamond uses a fully recorded Roland MT32 soundtrack, and I loved it. I loved the attention to detail and really using actual hardware to get these sounds. I loved the music in general. I loved everything about the soundtrack in the game. It fit perfectly with what was going on the screen. It had the right mix of mystery and a little bit of dread in some situations, and just a little bit of like lighthearted focus on other situations. It was pretty much perfect. I loved every aspect about the soundtrack. Outside of the soundtrack, there wasn't really a ton of other audio. There was some sound effects, which sounded fine. There was no voice acting, which in this case I think was probably a good thing, because this was an experience that, at least for me, I wanted to be able to read, and having no voice acting in the game allowed me to really immerse myself in this old school kind of experience. From an audio perspective, the Crimson Diamond was pretty much perfect. Moving on to the narrative and story, in the Crimson Diamond, you take the role of Nancy Maple, a geologist working for the Royal Canadian Museum in Canada in 1914. One day, there's a gigantic diamond that's found by a fisherman in the mining town of Crimson, Ontario. It draws the interest of tons of reporters, the government, and of course, the local geologists that might be interested in determining whether diamonds truly do exist in Crimson, Ontario. So, that's where you come into the story. You, as Nancy Maple, are sent to Crimson to investigate the land and determine whether there really are diamonds in Crimson, or if this was just a fluke encounter. You start your journey with that one singular focus, but as you investigate the geological aspects of the land and also interact with various characters that you might meet along the way, you start to learn that things aren't quite what they seem. Eventually, a series of events occurs that will test not just your knowledge of geology, but also all of your detective skills. Are you able to solve the underlying mysteries, both the obvious and the more obscure? There's only one way to find out. I'm not going to beat around the bush. I loved the story. I loved it. I loved how the story played out. I will admit that the game starts out a little slow. And especially in the first chapter or two of the game, I was a little bit unsure of how I would feel. After playing those chapters, I was like, I don't know. I don't know if this is for me. And I started to think, well, maybe I'm just not feeling, I wasn't feeling it totally. It was certainly interesting, but I wasn't as engaged early on in the game. But then it hooked me. And when I say it hooked me, I mean it hooked me. I got so deeply invested in this game's story. It has a really slow burn, especially at start out. But once it gets cooking, it gets really good. There are a ton of mysteries to uncover, and it is truly up to you to figure things out. The game doesn't give you much. It doesn't hold your hand. You have to figure things out for yourself, which is awesome. There's also the player choice aspect that I explained a little bit earlier, which ultimately impacts which ending you receive to that narrative. Everything about the story is amazing, and even though it's a little slow to start, at the end of the day, I love this story. The Crimson Diamond has an amazing narrative. Moving on to the playability and controls, there's really not much else to say here about the gameplay, at least, because it's pretty much your standard EGA text parser based adventure game, other than the fact that it plays way better than most of those old school EGA text parser based adventure games like we've been talking about. This game is so good though, and if I look at it from the perspective of if this were a title released back in the 80s, this game is so good that it makes me want to play other text parser games, even looking at it from today. Playing this game makes me want to re-examine and re-explore text parser games from the past. And I've played text parser titles before, like I've mentioned, and I've both enjoyed and disliked various aspects of old school text-driven adventures. This one, though, makes me forget that worse games exist, which honestly is a little bit of an issue because the fact is, worse games do exist. And this game is so good, though, it makes you forget about all of that and makes you think, oh, you know what? I may be a text parser gamer now. And I don't think I am. But at the end of the day, it's just a really good game. And I really enjoyed it. Luckily, Crimson Diamond is one of the better experiences from a text parser interface perspective, at least once you acclimate to the overall concept and feeling of playing a text parser game. Once you do, the whole thing becomes second nature, and it feels amazing to play. And especially after you get engaged in the story, you will want to keep playing it to see it through to the conclusion of the overall experience. It hooked me so hard that I think I started playing this on a Friday, and I didn't stop playing it. Well, I mean, other than sleeping and stuff like that, but I think I finished it on Saturday, and I couldn't stop playing it. I legitimately couldn't stop playing it because I was so engaged. Once it got going, I was really interested in seeing how everything plays out. Now, interestingly, the way it plays out, like we've been talking about, is dependent upon how good of a detective you are. Where that all really comes to a head is in the 7th chapter of the game, which represents the overall conclusion of the entire experience. The way the 7th chapter works is unlike any other chapter in the game. You don't have to explore an environment. You don't have to try to get clues. You don't have to try to pick up items. You don't have to try to interact with characters that are walking around in the game world. Chapter 7 is all about the conclusion of everything that you just experienced. And the way it plays out is you are effectively in a series of situations where the game prompts you for certain pieces of information. And all of those pieces of information are based upon things that you may or may not have experienced throughout the game. Some of that is just personal reflection around kind of what you've experienced, and the game will prompt you for actually coming through with some inner, or I guess it was called inner thoughts, I believe, is how they coined it in the game. But basically, it's like, what are you thinking about the different things that you experienced? And the game actually also offers an opportunity for it to tell you what you might have missed. And there are a couple of story threads that if you haven't filled or haven't fulfilled all of the different things in that story thread, the game might actually tell you, it's like, I wonder what would have happened if I did X, Y, Z. Now, nothing will actually change as a result of those wonderings, at least in this current playthrough, but it does give you something else to consider as you go back to play the game again, assuming you do want to play the game again, or you want to reload from a prior save or anything like that. So I thought it was an interesting way of kind of telling you, hey, here's what the game expected, and you may or may not have hit the mark for all of those things. But then it goes into almost like it's not really an interrogation, it's more of an interview, I'll say. And you're getting interviewed by an individual in some position of, I'll call it loosely, law enforcement, because I don't want to give away any of the spoilers around this. And in that interview, you'll be asked a number of different questions. And there's even some questions that you can choose to answer honestly or dishonestly. And based on what you say, that will affect the outcome of the game. Also, based on what you say will impact whether certain things happen for the end of the game. There's going to be certain situations where you're going to be asked to present evidence, and you have to figure it out in your own head what evidence that you have, either in your inventory or in your observations, could have potentially applied to those individual questions. And the good thing is the game does let you know when you've exhausted a given line of thought or a given train of thought around a certain suspect or subject or whatever. So it's not like it's entirely open-ended, but it feels pretty darn open-ended when you're getting asked these questions and you have to go back through your memory as well as your inventory to kind of say, I wonder if this applies here. And if you answer the question correctly, which once again, this is all text. This is all text-based, so you're answering these questions with text. And then the game will let you know whether it applies, whether it's something important or not. I loved this way of concluding the entire experience. And I will admit, the first time I went through it, I noticed, based on a couple of the questions that were asked, that, I missed something. I missed a couple of things, and I got to an ending, that I would say was semi-fulfilling, but not truly fulfilling. And I kind of knew that was going to be the case based on something that happened back in chapter 6, which I looked at and I thought, I bet you that could have played out differently. And of course, yep, it could have played out differently. And I did, in fact, go back and replay chapter 6 and chapter 7 after the fact and fixed my mistakes that then let me get to the better ending, the best ending, I'll say, or maybe it's the canon ending in the game. And that left me with a feeling of fulfillment. But the whole concept behind chapter 7 and behind this question answer, trying to tie everything together with what you just experienced and what you did in the game, it was awesome. And I loved how the game was so open that it really didn't feel like there was anything I could have said there that the game didn't interpret correctly, which is really tough in a text parser game. But I don't remember a single time where I typed something into the text parser during chapter 7 and the game was like, what the heck are you talking about? No, it understood me. It understood me completely in those sequences, and I thought it was great. I also really, really enjoyed the variability in the endings. I only played, I think I got 2 of the 4 endings. I believe there are 4 endings, if I'm not mistaken. I got 2 of the 4 during my playthroughs. I may go back and try to get the other 2. I should also mention, and this is not something associated with the endings at all, this literally just popped into my head. As with many old school Sierra games, there are actually ways to die in this game, but the way that it's handled is often comically, in that there's actually achievements associated with finding different ways to die in the game, and I think there might be 7-ish or so. But I enjoyed that. I actually enjoyed realizing and figuring out that you could die in different ways and trying to figure out how to die in those different ways. It definitely wasn't punishing like a Sierra game, though I will say if you haven't saved, you actually lose progress. It's not like there are autosaves in the game, but it's not like there are a ton of autosaves. It's not like the game is graceful enough to recognize when you're about to jump into a river, which I do not recommend, and then restore right there, like right at the bank of the river. That doesn't happen. You have to have saved the game at some point and go back and reload if you decide to do that. But I thought it was a nice touch and a nice homage to the old school Sierra adventure games. And honestly, the whole experience of the Crimson Diamond, from beginning to end, is truly a love letter to the EGA text parser era of gaming. And I've got to say, even though, and I mentioned this before, even though I don't have particular personal nostalgia for that era of gaming, this game nailed it, and I loved playing it. So, what is our verdict on the Crimson Diamond? Well, I know this is technically a newer title, but it really does feel like an old school adventure. And that said, it is actually way better than the majority of text parser games that I have personally played. So, because of that, and because the game honestly is just amazing from beginning to end, it's not a surprise that the Crimson Diamond has just become an automatic inductee into our pantheon of classic gaming. Lest anyone think that any modern game could make it into the pantheon solely because of modern amenities, no, just no. I'm not blinded by modern conveniences because there really aren't all that many modern conveniences in the Crimson Diamond. There's certainly a polishing, polished diamond, get it? Yeah, okay. It's definitely a polished experience in comparison to some of the older games that you might play, but it's still an old school experience. And the fact is, at the end of the day, regardless of any of the modern stuff, or regardless of anything else that's built into the Crimson Diamond, the core framework of the game is simply amazingly detailed, fun, engaging, and gripping. And if you're like me, it's likely going to be something that once you pick it up, you will not want to put it down. Which is why, for me, the Crimson Diamond is undeniably deserving of its spot in our pantheon of classic gaming. It is now time to talk about this week's gaming challenges for the Crimson Diamond. Your first challenge that's worth 1 coin is to simply sit down for a nice meal. Go enjoy yourself, have a great meal that's worth 1 coin. Your second challenge is to jump into a roaring river, but don't forget to save first. Little hint there, that is worth 2 coins. And then finally, for 3 coins, reach Chapter 4. If you can reach Chapter 4 in your playthrough, that is worth 3 coins. I challenge anybody to not continue to play the game once you reach Chapter 4, because by that point, it is burning and you're going to want to play it. But regardless, all you have to do is reach Chapter 4 and you will get 3 coins. As always, post proof of your accomplishments out on the CGT Gaming Challenges channel on Discord. Good luck! You're going to need it. That was our episode on the Crimson Diamond. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on Bubsy 3D for the Sony PlayStation. So send in your notes, send in your comments, get them featured on the show. Tell me what you think about Bubsy 3D. That one should be a good time. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast engines. And if you would feel so inclined, it would also be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings. Though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I'm hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Bubsy 3D. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.